following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by The Package Tourist in the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase, who tonight will be interviewing Miss Tammy McDole, the daughter of retired AFL and NFL legendary defensive end Ron McDole, a member in great standing of the over-the-hill gang that led the Washington Redskins to Super Bowl VII in 1972.
Thank you, Ralph. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our featured guest is Ms. Tammy McDole. Ms. McDole has spent years of her life on a labor of love and devotion, trying to get her father, the former legendary defensive end Ron McDole, into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. And tonight, we're going to do everything we can to help her in this Herculean task. Tammy, will you please tell our listeners why your father should be inducted in the Pro Football Hall of Fame? What did he do as a football player to deserve induction?
Well, actually, I am obviously a little bit prejudiced due to the fact that it is my father. But he actually had played 18 years as a defensive lineman, over 240 games, started in over 209 of those. He was a run defensive lineman. Honestly, he has definitely some sacks in his 18 careers, but he actually leads the record for interceptions for defensive linemen that has stood for over 50 years of 12. He has played on some fantastic defenses. One was the AFL 64-65 championship back in the good old days in Buffalo. And they actually have a record that still stands today. From the Week 6 of 1964 to Week 8 of 1965, the defense did not allow a rushing touchdown. This is also an NFL record that still stands today, and they are pretty darn proud of it, actually. So those are just a few, besides the fact that every person that I've ever met that has played against him is surprised that he is not in the Hall of Fame because of his level, intensity, and his level of play, and that the man played the game when he hit the field. He was consistent and never missed a game through the last 15 years of his career.
And wasn't he also a member in very high standing of the Over the Hill gang when he was with the Washington Redskins? Wasn't he a member of the crew?
Yes, he is. Actually, he is one of the original members of the Over the Hill gang. He went with George Allen, got him from Buffalo in 1970. That started in Washington in 1971, played with them till 1979. Season was his last year. He was definitely one of the cornerstones. He played left end. He pretty much played defensive end 16 out of his 18 years. He did play offensive line some in his early days and then also in college, but mainly he was a defensive lineman on the left side. And he is one of the 70th Redskins of all time, and he has been honored with that for years, actually, with that. So, yeah, that team and George Allen was a lot of fun, and these guys were all experienced and all extremely talented players. And when George came and brought his Over the Hill gang and his Ramskins with him, was the first time since 1945 that the Redskins actually went to the playoffs. And in 1972 was the first year that the Redskins ever went to a Super Bowl. Unfortunately, they lost to the perfect Miami team, but it was a good game, even though it was a sad loss.
Do you think that's, Tammy, one of the reasons why I had you on is because I'll tell you, interviewing you brings back nostalgic memories of me, because I was 9 years old in 1972, and that was the very first time in my life I was consciously aware of NFL football. That's the first season where I became aware of NFL football. And, of course, during that season was the glorious run of the Over the Hill Gang. And, of course, watching the Redskins beat the Dallas Cowboys in the NFC Conference Championship game and then competing against the Miami Dolphins in Super Bowl VII. It's like it brings back memory. It brings back a lot of memories to me. So that's why I'm very grateful that you're on here, because it's like reliving recapturing some my lost youth and all that. Question is this, Tammy. Do you think that Super Bowl loss may have contributed to the reason why your father didn't get an induction? In other words, if they had beaten Miami, you think that could have helped tip the scales in your father's favor, and he might have gotten induction because of that? You think that may have been a factor?
Yes, honestly, and this is my opinion. He has a couple strikes going against him of not being in the Hall of Fame or even being recognized for the Hall of Fame. 8 years of his career was played in the Old American Football League. The NFL still to this day has a prejudice against the AFL. Kansas City winning this weekend, wearing the AFL patch, was like the biggest. I mean, they were almost pretty much forgotten in this whole 100-year celebration of the NFL, and they are part of the NFL, even though they were a different league, the other league. That's one strike against him. He didn't play in. He only played in 2 Pro Bowls, and they were both in the AFL. He did not get nominated for any Pro Bowls in the NFL. That is also another reason, and he never won a Super Bowl. So that and kind of the playing for George Allen had a love-hate with the NFL, because he took all these old farts and they won, which just pissed off everybody else. So I think there's just some prejudice against him. And now, honestly, he retired in 1979. So, yeah. I mean, nobody knows who Ron McDole is. The writers of today who vote for the Hall of Fame have no idea who any of these guys are that played back in the day that built this league. I think is extremely sad, and is also a problem. I mean, they don't think anything ever started before 1980, 82, 90. You know, I mean, Buffalo Bills fans, who I love dearly, don't even recognize the AFL championships from 64 and 65. All they talk about is the 4 Super Bowls that the Bills didn't win. So, I mean, it's just part of it is just, you know, it's been so long. People just don't remember. And like you said, not winning the Super Bowl, I think, is a strike against him. And while he might not have been the number 1 quarterback sacker in the world, he was consistent. He was good. Ask any right guard he played against, they all know who he is, even to this day, because they faced him for 18 years.
In a sense, you know, the fact that he was such a great run defender, that he was not, quote-unquote, a sack master, that, in a sense, that kind of tips the scales against him as well. In other words, he wasn't like Deacon Jones, you know, because Deacon Jones really created the concept of being a sack master and all that. And you think that the fact that he was not, quote-unquote, you know, because being a sack master, that's the flashiest part of being a defensive lineman, you know, getting the sacks and all that. And your father, of course, wasn't doing that. So, in a sense, you think that's another pebble on the pile that tips the scales against your father, sadly and regrettably?
Well, definitely. First of all, you got to realize that most of the defensive stats weren't even kept until 1985. So all of these stats that you hear about anybody who played before 1985 were put together by NFL historians, because they actually went to the NFL, pulled out the books, and started writing them down. That's how I got Dad's stats. I mean, he has, from the research that I've gotten, he only has 82 sacks, but he has 929 tackles.
Yep.
And 548 of those are solo tackles. So the other note I want to do, and I love Deacon Jones, don't get me wrong, the man was fabulous. But he also played for the Redskins during the over-the-hill days, and guess what? He played behind my dad. My dad was the starting defensive lineman, not Deacon Jones. So while I'm not taking anything against Deacon Jones because he was a fabulous player, and they both played the same position, they were two different types of players. If you ever watch any film on my father, he is all over the place. He didn't just run forward. He ran forward, he ran sideways, he ran backwards, which is why he has 12 interceptions for a defensive lineman, which is pretty darn good.
So he was a great ball hawk, wasn't he? I remember like the New York Giants had Andy Robustelli. He was a great ball hawk and all that. So your father was in that mode. He knew how to get that ball, correct?
Yes, and that is actually, I mean, don't get me wrong. He was also a definitely powerhouse on the line at 200 and, well, playing weight's 263, but we all know that's just a number. But, you know, for back in the day, it being 6'4" and 200 and anywhere from 260 to 300, I mean, he was a big man. And for a big man, he moved. And he was a ball hog. He also, funny story real quick, he negotiated his contract with George Allen, which, again, back in the day, that's what these guys did. And he actually negotiated for bonuses of $5,000 for every interception that he gets. Now, that's an unusual negotiation for a lineman because most linemen are going, hey, I'm going to get this for this many sacks and this many fumbles or whatever. No, Dad went for interception. So he was really good at it. He had good hands, and he was quick. So I think that is actually why he has this record that still stands today.
I've noticed with some players, like some more recent inductees, they usually have like, you know, other Hall of Fame inductees like teammates of theirs or, you know, who help bang the drums in their favor. Do you have any notable players like any Hall of Fame inductees who are, you know, petitioning in your father's favor? Anyone banging those drums? Because I know it usually helps, like in like Baseball Hall of Fame and Football Hall of Fame. If you've got inductees who know, okay, yeah, you should bring in Ron McDole because he was great at this, that, and the other thing and all that. Do you have any notable players banging the drums helping you bang those drums?
I do not at this time, but that is definitely one of the things that I will be promoting is we are going to do a heavy email letter campaign to the senior members of the Hall of Fame. This is actually the 8 writers who specifically choose the senior portion of the Hall of Fame. But the other thing is I am going to contact players and coaches that my father either played with or against and see if they can throw in their support for Dad. I figure it can't hurt. You know, I mean, it definitely can't hurt. I ran into Rayfield Wright a couple of years ago and was talking to him down in Dallas. And, of course, he knew my father very well since he was the right end, tackle. And he told when I told him that I was trying to get Dad in the Hall of Fame, he looked at me and he goes, "What do you mean he's not in?" And I'm like, "Nope." And he goes, "That man should be in. That man never settled down. He ran. He used to get me in trouble because he used to run all the time. And everybody would go, 'Why aren't you running after McDole? He's running. Go.'" You know? So these guys, I think there's a lot of guys that will support. Again, you're talking about an era from 79 and before. I don't know if too many people after 79 or 80 who would even know who my dad was. They didn't play against them. You know, I mean, they just, unless they know their football history, they wouldn't know who he is.
Can you tell our listeners what is the process for induction? I mean, have you sort of studied the process? What is it like to those who really don't know? Can you explain it, Tammy?
Well, they have a program. It's changed, obviously, over the years, but they have a program where you can write in to request people to be considered for the Hall of Fame. unfortunately, that is only for players who had played more than 5 years and had only been out of the game since 2012. Well, that pretty much gets my dad out of that group. So back in the day, this rule has actually been in for a while, and I wrote a letter to the Hall of Fame after Dad had retired playing, and I got a letter back, and they said, thank you very much, but he's already been on every single player who's ever played in the NFL automatically goes on a list to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Then after 5 years, if they are not inducted, they go on, quote-unquote, I call it the dead list, but it's called the senior list. So then now you have how many players are inducted per year? Now you have 8 players, and of those 8, every other year there's 1 senior player and 1 contributor. So that's why you have so many more recent players inducted, and you only go back to the seniors. I mean, Mick Tingelhoff, who has played with my dad in Buffalo, in college, that knew them forever, was inducted a couple of years ago, and which is great. So, it's just it's a process now that there's 8 writers. The writers represent a city in every place there is a team, and they get together and they get a list, and then they narrow it down. They have to have more than 80% vote between the writers, and that's how. And then they bring it up, and then that's how it's voted on. So that's how, in a nutshell, and very simplified, it is. But it's a shame that these older guys. Even the senior list. If you looked at the senior list, because they just put in a whole bunch for the 100-year anniversary.
Yeah.
There was only 1 that actually even played at any time in the AFL. Everybody else is more modern day. Yeah. So again, it's a shame. I really thought with my dad's book that people would now know who he is, and I pushed hard to get the word out there, and so people would even know who he is, and more people do, obviously, because of his book. But, there's a whole crew, there's a whole generation or two that have no idea. It's the same people who go, why are these people looking for more retirement money? They make millions of dollars, and they just blow it. Well, those are the people who are uninformed that have no idea what it was like to play in the AFL, NFL before 1982 or 83.
I know.
Because it was a completely different game. It was a completely different way of life. And when my dad retired, the most question was like, people used to ask me, what did your dad miss about playing? So I finally asked him. I said, well, Dad, what do you miss? He goes, that I could play 1 game today and make more money than I made my whole career.
I know. It's kind of sad. I know. I understand what you're talking about. I'd like to tell my listeners, before 1982, very few players were making 6-digit salaries. Tammy, what was your father's best salary? Did he ever tell you what his absolute best was?
If I'm not mistaken, I have actually an old contract between him and George. Dad made $75,000.
Wow.
His last contract, so that was mid-70s, which is a lot of money.
Yeah, back then, yeah.
And then, when he left Buffalo, I think he was only making 38. So that was in the early 70s. But my dad, when people don't realize, when my father signed in 1961, which sounds really old now, but when he signed with St. Louis, he made $13,000.
So that was about the norm back in those days. Yeah, that was pretty much the norm when you think about it. Yeah.
And that's why they all had to work on the off season.
Yep.
Every single one of these guys had an off season job. They had to. They couldn't support their family.
And free agent was basically the free agency that we know today was basically almost non-existent. I mean, or extremely limited. You know, with a lot of circumscriptions and prohibitions. So, your father was playing basically financially. Having agents, you didn't really have an agent. You had to do it all yourself. So basically, your father had to work under a lot of disadvantages in many ways.
Well, I don't know. Maybe not having an agent was a good thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you needed to know how to negotiate. Dad, in all 18 years of his career, he negotiated his own contract. He didn't have an agent. He's never had an agent. I mean, it's just not the way it is. So, again, with George, his last contract, I believe, was like $75,000, but then he negotiated incentives. Like I said, the interception incentive. And I'll tell you a funny story about that. Dad tells a story. If you read the book, he said that one game they were running all over the left end, and Dad went off the field. He went up to George and he goes, "Man," he goes, "they're running all down that side." And he said, "Well," George Allen looked at him and said, "If you would stay on the line, they wouldn't be doing that." And he goes, "I need interceptions. My kids need braces."
Beautiful.
So, it was always negotiating, and things like that. And that was just the era of the game. That was really before. I mean, the only one who actually really made any money back in the old days was Joe Namath. And they were all excited for Joe to make that kind of money because that meant more money will be coming, so, and back then, actually, the AFL, everybody, they were all friends with each other. I mean, they played against each other, but they were still all friends because they were all in the same boat. And they were all against, the NFL really thought of all the players who played in the AFL weren't good enough to play in the NFL. That was their thought. There's still that thought, that the AFL was never as good as the NFL, and it was all the rejects that went to the AFL. Well, my dad got drafted by Denver and St. Louis. So, they both had an AFL and NFL draft, and honestly, it went down to who was going to pay them the most money. And the NFL wasn't paying much more money then either.
Yeah. It's interesting. You talked about Super Bowl VII. I like to tell my listeners, Ron McDole actually was one win away in competing in Super Bowl I because the Buffalo Bills lost to the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFL Championship game. That was going to decide who was going to compete against the Green Bay Packers in Super Bowl I. So, if Buffalo had been able to win that game, your father would have competed again in Super Bowl I against Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers. And who knows, maybe that could have helped, a little bit, in bolstering your father's case.
Oh, without a doubt. See, the Buffalo Bills actually went to the playoffs from 1963 to 1966.
Yep.
Now, this is the AFL, not the NFL.
Yeah.
And they won the AFL championship in 64 and 65 and played against Kansas City in the 1966. And that was the first year that the AFL champion was going to play the NFL champion. And you're right. It was. These guys really thought, and Dad talked about it. He goes, we played our heart out. It just wasn't, it just wasn't meant to be. And there were some stupid mistakes like they always do. Same thing he says about the Miami Dolphins. It was a heck of a game. It was only 14-7 game. And it was, both ways, it was a good game. And it just didn't fall on that side. Could you take it back? Sure. And you're right. Who knows what the Bills would have done? Because that Bills defense back in that day was absolutely phenomenal. In 1965, they only let an average of 16.1 yards a game.
I like to inform my listeners that Buffalo Bills in the old AFL was a rarity. Usually the AFL was a highly offensive league that emphasized the pass, explosive offenses, but the Bills were a rare team. They actually won with their defense, which was very rare because other teams like Houston, the Chiefs, San Diego Chargers, and various other, and the Jets, were high-octane offense, but the Bills were always their defense. You know, they had the late Jack Kemp, who later became a U.S. congressman and a presidential candidate. You know, he was their quarterback. You had Cookie Gilchrist at running back for a couple of years there. But yeah, they had one of the most potent defenses in AFL, and not just AFL history, but pro football history. So your father was very much a key member of, you know, making the Buffalo Bills one of the premier defenses in pro football history.
Oh, without a doubt. And you're right, that defense, and it wasn't just the defensive line. However, the defensive line obviously is your first force. I mean, you had Tom Day, my father, Jim Dunaway, and Tom Sustak. And these guys were beasts. I mean, they were just beasts. But then you also had Stratton and Edgar and Tracy, you know, in the backfield. You know, these guys, I mean, the whole defense was just – here's the thing that Dad has always said about the defense and actually about the Bills in general, and I'm sure this pretty much went for almost all AFL players on AFL teams. You played wherever you needed to play. And if they needed you to play guard, you played guard. If they needed you to come and kick, you kicked. If you needed to be a quarterback and you were one in high school, guess what? You went and played quarterback. So it was just the way the game is, you know. I mean, and if you got hurt, see, here's the thing. If you got hurt and you didn't play, you didn't get paid.
Wow.
So you never laid on the field. I mean, you just didn't. You just said, okay, I'm hurt. I'm going. Let's go. So, I mean, and that was just, the mentality was that way. That was just the way it was just the way you played. It was just the way the game was played. You know, there was none of this sitting out. You didn't get paid if you didn't play, so you played. And it was just, and you're right, the defense, AFL was known for its offense. That was the big difference, which made the AFL so exciting, is you had a very high-scoring game. You had lots of quarterback throws and passes, where the defense at that time was mostly run. So it made it much more exciting. But that defense in Buffalo, I mean, they were phenomenal. Like I said, they still have an NFL, AFL record that spans over 50 years. But nobody talks about it. Nobody talked about it.
Yep.
They talk about the Iron Curtain, and they talk about the Purple People Eaters, and, you know, and they don't talk about these guys who did not allow a rushing touchdown for 17 games, including playoffs.
You know, Tammy, I was talking to an old football historian. His name is Coach T.J. Troop, and we got discussing about, you know, the pre-Super Bowl matchups, and he talked about if there had been a Super Bowl between the 64 Bills and the 64 Cleveland Browns, he thought that 64 Bills team could have beaten the Browns in a head-to-head matchup. He thought the Bills defense could have probably contained the legendary Jim Brown in a head-to-head matchup. I mean, that's how much praise he had for your father, you know, your father and his teammates, their effectiveness as a defense. I don't know if anyone ever told you that. His name is T.J. Troop. Yeah.
No, but I can tell you that Dad and his peers, they felt that their defense could play any NFL team and kick their butt. I mean, they just did. Yep. That's just the way they played so well as a team. They didn't even really have to talk to each other. They all knew what they were going to do. Everybody just played together. That 64-65 defense was just phenomenal. And they could have played any team in the NFL. They really wanted to play the Green Bay Packers because they really thought that they would play very well defensively against them. For sure. So, you know, we all can wish and hope and wish it would have gone that way. But you're right. If he would have played in the first Super Bowl, even if he didn't win, that would help to get into the Hall of Fame. I mean, nobody talks about, you know, if you ask the Redskins about the Super Bowl, it's all Gibbs era, which I'm not taking anything against them, too, because they were awesome. The Hogs were fabulous, and Joe Gibbs was a fantastic coach. But Nobody talks about the fact that the Redskins, when George Allen came in 1971, took them to the playoffs for the first time since 1945.
That's right.
Put them in the first Super Bowl, and that they actually went to the Super Bowl out of the 8 years Dad was there. Into the playoffs.
Yeah, it's the only time. Yeah, it's the only time. Yeah. Yeah. Hello? Are we still here?
I'm here.
Okay, I heard. Sorry about that, Tammy. Yeah. Question, Tammy. I've noticed on Facebook there are a bunch of Facebook groups of people doing like you're doing, trying to get players into the Hall of Fame. The daughter of Oakland Raiders linebacker Phil Villapiano, she, like you, is mounting a campaign to get her father in. Do you, by any chance, network with other players or other family members who are like yourself trying to get their loved ones into the Hall? Do you do anything like that? Network with them, compare notes, or go over strategies or anything like that, or talk over ideas? Do you do anything of that nature, Tammy?
I had talked to, of course I'm going to forget the name. Who was a Kansas City player that just got in last year?
Willie Lanier or no? Oh, nuts. Jan Stenerud? I forget.
No.
I forget. I'm sorry, Tammy. I'm sorry.
That's okay. But, yeah, we have talked. I know Joe Jacoby's family is trying to get him in and doing a promotional thing like that. I have talked to people who, it is. It doesn't hurt. It can't hurt. You know what I mean? It can't hurt. It can't hurt to do a campaign. It can't hurt to do an email. The biggest problem is finding emails or addresses to be able to send things to, people to. But yes, there are other groups out there. Honestly, to tell you the truth, I've heard also that to get in the Hall of Fame now, you have to do this, and you have to donate money.
Oh boy! Oy vey.
It's getting, like I said, getting people, at least for our era, my era, and Dad's era. It's education. It's trying to get these guys who weren't born until 1970 something to even know who about these. And honestly, to tell you, I have a pet peeve with the fact that players today don't know the history of the teams they play with.
Okay.
They don't know the history.
Yeah. Tammy, let's say through the grace of God, your father, the phone call comes and they say, Mr. McDole, you've just been inducted in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Does your father have a speech prepared for that beautiful, wonderful, magical day if he gets that phone call? Does he have a speech prepared?
Oh, heck no. No, he doesn't think it will ever happen. He does not think that, he honestly thinks I'm wasting my time. He also thought I was wasting my time when I made him write this book. He said, nobody really cares. I'm like, so no,
I care.
If they called and said, you're on the list, and he got in, he will probably think it's a joke. He just doesn't think that will ever happen. He feels that he was he loved the game. He went and did his job. He had a lot of fun at it. He was a hard worker, and he was good at it. That's what he thinks.
Another thing, with the inductees, they get introduced. Let's say your father, again, gets the nod. Who would introduce your father if he actually, through the grace of God, got the nod? Any ideas as to who he would want to introduce him, on that magical day, if that magical day ever comes?
No, we've never really talked about it. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Pat Fisher.
Okay.
My dad and Pat Fisher have known each other since their freshman year in college. They actually played together at St. Louis because they both got drafted by St. Louis, and then Pat and Dad played the last of their career. And Pat played 17 years, and my dad played 18. And he's his best friend. And they're like Mutt and Jeff because Dad's 6'4" and 300 pounds, and Pat's 5'6" and 100 pounds wet. But I don't know. I don't think it's something he's even thought about, or but I personally would not be surprised if it was Pat, if he was still around.
Tammy, this is the last question. Is there any way for the general public to help in your campaign? If so, would you please tell our listeners how we can help?
Well, I think the best thing that I can do right now is he does have a Twitter account, he does have an Instagram account, and he does have a Facebook account. I manage all of those because, hell, I don't think he could turn on a computer. He is going to be 81 this year. So that is probably the best way. And honestly, the best way is to write letters to the Senior Hall of Fame writers. You can find that information on the Hall of Fame webpage. And then also the address is you can just write a letter to the Hall of Fame Senior Committee, and that would probably be the best way. I'm going to get that information out there probably on his webpage so people will have that. I will also post all of his stats and his interesting tidbits of information that most people don't know. I'm also going to try to reach out to, like I said, Hall of Fame players who were his peers that he played against or with, and see if they would recommend. And that's the only thing I can think of to do. So a writing campaign is probably the best. There's a lot of people out there. Don't get me wrong, I understand this, and I don't take it personally, but there's a lot of people out there that don't think he belongs in the Hall of Fame, that he just wasn't good enough because he didn't win Super Bowls and he wasn't in Pro Bowls. Well, I say to that man. So.
Yep. Well, Tammy, I like to end it with this story. As a youth, like I said, I was 9 years old when your father beat the Dallas Cowboys in an NFC Conference Championship game to earn a berth in Super Bowl VII. And one of my fondest memories was the cameras are in the locker room, and there was George Allen leading the whole team. Now, the over-the-hill gang, the guys are in their 30s, right? Yet they were hopping up and down and yelling and screaming like 17 and 18-year-olds. They were like young kids again, and I will always live on in my memory as a beautiful moment, because they may have been called the Over the Hill Gang, but from that magical night, they were young, and they were brilliant, and they were the best in the NFC. And may God bless you and your father, and we wish you the very best of luck in your campaign. And I hope when that day comes that your father gets that phone call, I'll have you on again and you tell us the story about how it all happened. Okay, Tammy?
That would be great. And any help that would be, to just get the word out would be fabulous. And most appreciated. Thank you so very much.
It's a great honor and a privilege, Tammy, and our warmest regards to your father, okay?
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, and God bless you, and goodbye. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show where I'll be interviewing baseball historians Bob Lemoyne and Bill Nolan on their newly released book, The Glorious Bean Eaters of the 1890s. Thank you and good night.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.